Hello and welcome to University Television Presents. My name is Ashley Cox and today I'm here with the Associate Professor and Chair Department of Public Policy and Administration, Dr. Gregory Hill. How's it going, Dr. Hill?
Great, thank you, Ashley.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for being here. Really appreciate your time. So Dr. Hill, can you please explain some of your educational background?
Sure. I grew up here in Boise and had the opportunity to go to Idaho State University. At Idaho State I got a bachelor's degree in zoology. Decided not to go to optometry school, then went and earned a master's in public administration, did an internship with the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality and decided not to be a bureaucrat, so I ended up at Texas A&M University where I did a PhD in political science.
Oh, wow.
And then came back here to Boise State. This was my first job out of school in 2005.
Very nice, a little bit everywhere.
Been around.
That's awesome. So you teach a couple classes here on campus about public policy analysis, public policy theory, and governmental relations. Can you explain those courses and what you teach in them?
You bet. At our department, the Public Policy and Administration Department, we're a graduate-only department. So we have a master's in public administration and a PhD in public policy and administration, which is brand new. So our students in the master's classes take a public policy theory class, which is essentially how is public policy formed, how is it created, what are the steps involved, and what's the context around which it's developed. It's a great class for students because most of our students are mid-career working professionals who have spent a lifetime, or a career time anyway, in public service, and now we're looking at it from the academic side, or the academic perspective. In the policy analysis class, it's more of a skills-based class where we use econometric techniques, cost-benefit analysis, we develop some survey research skills, and we give the students an opportunity to practice those skills in real-life situations with agencies. That's a class where the students get experience with not only the policy process itself, but many of the agencies in the state are sitting on tremendous amounts of data that they just don't know what to do with. And they don't know how to analyze it because they don't have the human capital or the skill set necessary. So the students who take this class are focusing on the opportunity to analyze data, which helps them develop policies and hopefully impact public policy. So those are the two classes in the policy stream that I teach frequently. The intergovernmental class, as many people know, public policy itself isn't constrained to the federal government or the state government or local governments. They all have to interact, and there's certain policies and procedures under the Constitution that limits that ability or magnifies that ability. So we use that class to help develop strategies and skills around that. It's a case study method, so we'll talk about different cases that have had real-life cases. Our classic example is the Challenger disaster, or if there's a mine explosion in a state or something like that, where you have different agencies who are interacting with the other state and local levels and nonprofits. Katrina, for example, is one we use. That you look and you see all the different agencies and different state level, federal level, nonprofit organizations, even some private organizations. So that's what the intergovernmental class is based around. I've also taught the budgeting class over time, which sounds terribly boring, but actually is not. And the students learn some skills in account management and public finance, and how to use their spreadsheets as something more than just an electronic Christmas card list. So those are some of the classes that I teach.
Very nice. Out of those classes, which one is your personal favorite to teach and why?
Well, I often say I don't have any favorites, but if I did, the one that I would have would be policy analysis. I think it's great because the students get a chance to be grounded in theory, economic theory, policy theory, but also have the practical opportunity to deal with real problems. They have to go out and find an agency, find a contact in the agency that has a problem, and then develop a survey. And we go through the survey development process, which is a very rigorous process. It's not as intuitive as many people think it might be. It's actually very challenging to put together a good survey, and then they administer that survey. So and then they have a chance to present their results, or their survey construction anyway, in an academic conference format. which scares them to death. They have to look at each other's work and give each other feedback, but it's a chance for them to grow a little bit, and I get exposed to a lot of really interesting policy worlds that I don't interact with professionally.
Wow, that's awesome. You conduct research on multiple subjects under public policy. So what's some of the research that you've done in the past? What are you currently working on, and what would you like to work on?
Yeah, great question. Some of the work that I've done, my training has primarily been in the field of public management and performance measurement. So how do managers in the public sector affect performance? I spent the early part of my career looking specifically at managers' impact on performance after you've changed managers. So there's been a succession event in an organization, for example. What's the impact on performance, and how are those impacts mitigated? And one of my favorite pieces that I worked on, I'm not only a big fan of academics, but I'm also a big baseball fan. And I had a very sympathetic dissertation advisor, and he allowed me to collect data on baseball managers and use them as a proxy for public managers. I argued that public managers and baseball managers were alike in a lot of ways, one of which was they don't get to hire and fire their players, they don't get control of salaries, they take blame for many things they don't have control over, much like a civil service protected public manager would. So I had 25 years worth of data, we collected and analyzed some results, and so I had an opportunity to publish that and then also present that at the National Baseball Hall of Fame Conference, which was fantastic.
Oh, wow.
So that's a fun project that I'd like to get back onto someday. More of the work that I've been doing has been in terms of school districts and how superintendents affect performance. That's where I started and have kind of worked in that field for a while. And it led to an interesting question one day. I was sitting at the home of a friend who lives in Declo, which is a suburb of Burley. And we were talking about a car accident that happened near his home. And in Declo, it's an agrarian community. It's a lot of agriculture, a lot of dairies. And he said both of the cars in the accident were driven by undocumented immigrants. And he was talking about the effects that would, because there was life flight involved in hospital transportation in the emergency room. He was talking about the financial effects. Then he was talking about the effects of those undocumented children on his children's school experience. And I thought to myself, hey, this seems like an empirical question, an interesting question. I do work in schools on management. I thought maybe if there was a way that we could look at this and say, if there is a negative effect of undocumented students on performance, then maybe we can find a way to make those negative effects go away, or we can at least look at that. And so that's how I started doing work on immigration policy, which is where I've spent sort of the balance of my time recently. We found some really interesting results with this project. It's a large project. One of our biggest challenges in working with undocumented students is, by definition, undocumented populations are hard to count because they don't want to be found primarily. And so in most states by law, or all states by law, can't have to admit any student who comes to school. They can't exclude you for reasons of citizenship. And so most states don't collect any data on whether or not students are undocumented. It so happens that Texas does, and Texas is where we were doing the balance of our work on the public school work that we were doing beforehand. So we were able to collect some data and do some analysis, and ended up with some really interesting findings.
Wow. What research would you like to do in the future?
I think I'd like to the immigration work that we're working on gives us many, many avenues forward. So I'm continuing to do that. I have a colleague in Ohio that I write with, and that we are sort of developing a long-term project that I think is very exciting. We're working now on school districts. We're going to move to hospitals and social service provision, and then larger immigration-related policies, which will include some interviewing of undocumented immigrants and their usage of public services and so forth. So that there's that vein, which which will be kind of a long and fruitful vein, hopefully, as we move forward. It seems to be constantly in the news, so at least it's relevant, and so we're moving in that direction. The other direction would be to refocus back on the management work that I started doing a while ago, and if possible, sort of update the baseball work that we're doing, and maybe even expand into football or something like that.
Very nice. So the baseball management work that you did, you said you presented that at the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
So all your research, where does that actually go? Does it go in articles? Do you do presentations about it?
Yeah, great. We do a little bit of everything with ours. We present 2 or 3 conferences a year. We publish in articles. We have a book manuscript that we're developing that it'll be an academic book, but generalizable to the interested public. We've also done a fair amount of radio interviews and things and some a little bit of television interviewing for people. It's a topic that's interesting enough that that it seems to attract some attention, especially in our findings. Our findings in the initial work that we were doing, we found that when we looked at the effect of undocumented students on overall district level performance, we didn't see the negative effect that we had predicted we would see, which really caught us off guard. We thought we would see that as you increase the number of undocumented students, the test scores would go down. We just couldn't find evidence of that. We had a hard time believing our own work, so we tried. We did lots of different ways. Still couldn't find any evidence of it. So that led us to some more interesting questions. Are these conventional wisdom philosophies that we're reading in the paper and seeing on the news, are they in fact verifiable? That's really what the work that we're trying to do, looking at these conventional wisdom hypotheses, if you will, and trying to determine whether or not they're accurate, valid. So that's an interesting project.
Yeah. So talking on immigration, one of your most recent works is Beyond the Blue podcast, and it was about the myth and emotions of immigration. And what did you specifically talk about in that podcast?
Yeah, that was a fun project. We did that. I did that about I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago or so. The gist of the podcast was to give a kind of a general overview of immigration history in the U.S. Immigration has gone through. It's been around for the history of the U.S. But it's gone through these certain number of phases. I talked a little bit about the phases of immigration. The Puritan immigration, and then when the Irish came, and the European immigrations, and then the immigrations from Central and South America. You have these sort of phases that you've gone through. So we talked a little bit about that, and then we talked about I talked about an idea that we're developing, what I'm calling the optimal immigration framework, which is thinking about immigration rather than thinking about it as kind of an emotive-driven, supercharged, emotional discussion. I wanted to put it into a framework that allows us to think about it on 2 dimensions, and that is the socio-political effects of immigration and the economic effects of immigration. So develop a framework that we talk about a little bit in the podcast, and then some policy solutions ideas that sort of abound out there, and what we think those solutions or maybe some alternate solutions that people aren't thinking of. So.
Yeah, with those policies that you've kind of discussed and you mentioned, like you talked about in your podcast. So how do you think immigration affects our community and our country at a large scale?
Yeah. It's immigration is something that we've always had in the U.S. and in Idaho. Idaho's been a state that has dealt with immigration constantly because of the agricultural economics of Idaho. We've constantly had, and in the 50s and 60s, the federal government had programs that kind of institutionalized immigration, where immigrants would come up from Mexico and they would sort of follow the harvesting patterns around up through California and Oregon and Idaho and Montana, and then back and circle back around into Mexico. When that program went away, many of those immigrants would come and just stay and develop roots in Idaho. And so Idaho has a long history with it. There are some consequences, lots of consequences, lots of things to talk about with respect to immigration, and it's not going away, so figuring out the solution might be a good way to go.
Yeah. Do you have any statistical knowledge of how many immigrants are actually coming to the state still, and how many of them are legal and illegal?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that, and again, this is one of the biggest challenges that we have with doing work on undocumented immigrants, that by definition they don't want to be counted. Right? So what we use a set of estimates from the Pew Hispanic Center, or we use a model like theirs to do estimates, but their estimate is that in 2009, the illegal immigrant population in the U.S. peaked out at about 12 million. And since then, it's kind of been going down. And they feel like it's bottomed out at about 11 million, and we're now kind of in the 11.5 million area. In Idaho, it's much smaller than that. It's about 30,000 undocumented workers or immigrants in Idaho. Those are the predictions. What's interesting about the illegal immigrants as a whole number versus as a component of the workforce, if you break them up as a component of the work, they make up about 2.5% of Idaho's population, but they make up about 4% of Idaho's workforce. So what does that mean? That means that the many undocumented workers who are here are working at a greater percentage than non-undocumented workers. And it leads to some really interesting hypotheses on how undocumented workers affect the workforce in the economics of a state or of a country. If we don't have a great sense of the year-to-year flow of immigration and immigration. However, what the predictions seem to suggest is that the sort of large immigration out of Mexico primarily, but other states that border Mexico on the south, that has slowed down significantly. So we're not seeing the same immigration rates. What are the reasons for that? It's hard to say. It may be that the immigrating populations have reached some sort of capacity. It may be that the economy is getting better in some of those states. What we do know is that there's a constant flow up the geographic map, if you will, of immigrants. So immigrants from south of Mexico are immigrating into Mexico for work, and then Mexican immigrants are immigrating into the U.S. We're not seeing a huge immigration of Americans into Canada, but we may. I don't know. So.
Thank you. Okay, in your professional opinion, just because you've done so much research and you have so much knowledge, how do you think the immigration laws should be or should be handled?
Yeah, that's a great question. That's $1 million question. There's a couple of things that are happening now, I think, that will lead to immigration policies to come. One of them is having to do with students. It's called the DREAM Act, which is students who go to college, undocumented students who go to college, gain some form of citizenship upon graduation. My guess is that's going to happen. As I said earlier, undocumented students cannot be denied admission to public education up through the 12th grade based on citizenship, and so many of them are matriculating into college, going to college, graduating from college, have spent most of their life, if not, well, not all of their life, but most of their life here. And so my guess is that there's enough momentum now that those people who graduate from college who are undocumented will gain some form of citizenship. Interestingly enough, I would argue that there's likelihood, you say this very carefully, that there's a chance that as we reassess the quota system that we use to allow immigrants into the country, that as the political environment becomes more conservative, that we might actually become more open to the idea of immigrants because the economy is driving that. Right now in the U.S. we define these very static numbers of immigrant visas that we allow. My guess that number is going to change. It'll probably increase. It'll go up. It'll be more reflective of economic need. Like I said earlier, the undocumented workers that are here are working at a greater pace than non-undocumented workers, and so you see that there's a demand. And simple economics would argue that supply and demand. If there's a demand, it'll create supply, and the supply creates demand, and so there's a chance that we change the quota market. I think the other area of interest that we might consider, and I don't know if it's being considered or not, is that we evaluate the tariff agreements between Mexico and the U.S. and look at how we're producing goods and services. It could be that if, rather than investing $5 billion in a fence, that money becomes invested in the Mexican economic infrastructure, that you change the incentive structure for undocumented to come, or people to come to the U.S. undocumented. That path is a brutal one, and so I think for immigrants, it must be terrible where they're coming from to go through the path to come to the U.S. as an undocumented immigrant. So one approach could be to change the incentive structure and invest proactively into the Mexican economy or the El Salvadoran economy or whatever, where we're seeing the primary number of undocumenteds come.
And then can you also explain, some people might be confused about this, what is the difference between an immigrant and a refugee?
Yeah, that's a good question. Immigrants come to the U.S. through a visa process. There's a visa process that's required that you apply for, and you go through a certain number of steps. Refugees come to the U.S. as a population has been displaced. So whether it's economic or religious or because of war, that population has been displaced from their home population and is moved to a place like Boise, for example, which has a large refugee population. And then that state or that country will, in effect, adopt them and care for them for a period of time, in which they can go through a process and become naturalized if they choose to stay. It's a different process. It's a process that the refugee population is brought here primarily out of protection, whereas an immigrant population comes primarily on their own volition. So they go through, it feels similar in a lot of ways, but the path to where they're getting is different, or how they got here is different, I should say, and where they're trying to go. States often have, states that are open to refugee populations have systems in place that help them get work and get assimilated into their communities. It's not generally the case with immigrant populations.
Moving back to your department specifically, you mentioned that you were only a graduate program here at Boise State. So where do you see a lot of your students coming from? And then once they transition from graduating, where do you see them heading, most of them?
Yeah, excellent. Our students are primarily, traditionally I should say, have been from working professionals at state, whether in state government, city government, many nonprofit organizations. And they come to us looking for an opportunity to gain more education, gain a master's degree in public administration. There have been an increasing number of students who are coming right out of their undergraduate programs and entering our master's degree with an intention of entering public service, whether that's state level or local level. We see all levels of government primarily. We don't see many entering the federal service because Idaho is a long ways from, but we do have a number of federal agencies here. Upon graduation, we find them ending in places like state agencies. For example, the director of Department of Agriculture is one of our alumni. The former director of the DEQ is one of our alumni. Oh. In many of the nonprofit organizations, those folks have gone through our program, which is great for internships because it helps our students get internships. It gives us access to groups that we, if we're looking to get data, do some more research, it gives us better access there. We also have a small number of people, but a significant number, that go into the private sector who are working in government relations fields. So whether they work as lobbyists or in public finance or with, for example, banks or credit unions who are working with a school district, for example, to do bond elections, and so forth. We have a fair number of those. Our new program, which is our PhD in Public Policy and Administration, is a program that's designed not for academics per se. We're not necessarily producing people to go back and we're not recreating ourselves, so to speak. But what we are looking to address is the need that I spoke about earlier, and that there, in many of Idaho's state agencies and in the legislature, which is a citizen legislature and doesn't have a lot of staff support, we're looking to provide training, skills, critical thinking skills, that those folks can go in and run and work in research centers, nonprofits, think tanks, as good, solid policy analysts. Some of our students right now working as directors of research for the state board, for the state courts, for the Idaho legislature. So we have, that's kind of our goal with our doctoral students.
Awesome. Well, Dr. Hill, thank you so much for all your information today and spending some time with us. We really, really appreciate it, and I learned a lot for sure.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, thank you all so much for tuning in to University Television Presents. My name is Ashley Cox, and we'll see you next time.